Okay, Algebra 1, in preparation for the final exam, I've given you a review packet for Chapter 6. And I've explained that these sections of Chapter 6 are the only ones you're going to be responsible for. They're the only ones that we're going to be covering in this video lesson. Here I'm just going to walk through some of the problems that were in that review packet for Chapter 6 and explain how the answers were calculated. So here's that first question. Write an inequality for each graph. Well, in this case, notice first of all that there's the dot there at -6, and notice that the -6 is to the left, or in other words, less than everything else. Also notice that the circle is shaded in. When it's shaded in, it's underlined. When it's an open circle, it's not underlined. And so, as I say, all the stuff is to the right. Call that x if you want. Notice that we usually tend to have x on the left. It doesn't matter, but in case you're used to that, you would spin it around. But make sure when you spin it around that the open end of the arrow stays on the x side and the pointed end stays at the -6. The pointed end always points at the smaller piece. So in this case, the smallest piece in the blue picture is -6. And the open end always points at the bigger piece. So we called it x is greater than -6. And the computer program that generated this question called it n instead of x, but came up with the same answer we have. Moving on to question 3 out of the review packet, making it a little bit harder here now. We've got to do a little bit of solving first before we can graph. Notice there are 2 questions here. I said before in class, and I said after the exam that you took back a few months ago about Chapter 6, you got to answer both questions, solve and graph. If you only answer one of those 2 questions, if you only give me the answer to one, I can only give you half of the credit. So what we have to do here is get n by itself. So you add 1 to both sides. You're going to end up with n now is greater than or equal to -1. So you're going to have to make a circle at -1. You're going to shade in that circle because, as I said before, when it's underlined, it's shaded in. And n, the stuff, is to the bigger side, in other words, to the right, and that's a simple but perfectly adequate graph. It says everything that we're looking for is greater than or equal to -1. And the computer program did it this way, but it gave the same answer. Again, notice it gave 2 answers. It solved and it graphed, and so did we. A little bit more complicated for some folks when you have to divide. So right now a is being divided by something. To undo division, we multiply. So we multiply both sides by 2. We're going to end up canceling the 2's on the left and just have a. That's what we wanted to do, is get a by itself. So now a is greater than -10. Notice this time, when it's not underlined, it's an open circle at -10. And again, a is bigger than all this stuff, so a is to the right of -10. All right, now we get more complicated again. And because this is a more complicated problem, let's move it down here and have some room to work it out. I've got to eventually get r by itself, but there are a lot of layers that I have to unpeel. And I unpeel those in the opposite order of PEMDAS. So the first thing I'm going to move is that 1. Subtract that away, and I'm going to end up with 63 on the right, and the 1 has left us on the left. Next thing I've got to unpeel is that 3. You could distribute the 3, and a lot of students, when we reviewed this, preferred to distribute the 3. If you want to do that, fine. I prefer to just move the 3 as soon as I can, so I divide it away. And so now I'm going to have just 5 minus, whoops, don't mean to be doing that. Hang on. Just 5 minus 4r on the left. On the right, 63 divided by 3 is 21. Now, the next layer to move is the 5. I subtract that away. And now I'm going to have -4r is greater than or equal to, well, 21 minus 5 is 16. Last thing to move is the -4. I have to divide it away. And this becomes an important point. When you divide by a negative or multiply by a negative across an inequality, the direction of the inequality changes. So here I am dividing by -4, but notice that arrow has now changed. So now, those canceled, I just have r. 16 divided by -4 is -4. but my arrow direction has changed. And the computer program came up with the same answer, r is less than or equal to -4. And they graphed it the way you should have, with a closed circle at -4 and all of the stuff, in other words, the arrow, going to the left or smaller side from that circle. Compound inequalities. You can have or inequalities. You can also have and inequalities. Let's start with an or example, number 13 out of the review packet. When you have or inequalities, well, let's move it down here where we can have some more room. You're going to have two problems to solve. It's not a big deal. You're going to have to solve the left one and the right one. It is twice as much work, but it's not any more complicated than doing twice as much work. But the important thing to remember, when you have an or inequality, your graph is going to have an opening in the middle. It's going to have a left piece, a right piece with a gap or opening in the middle. So think opening and or, those go together. Left and right side, solving them both. On the left, you should end up with, you end up dividing by a negative eventually, so your arrow direction changes and it becomes n is greater than 7. On the right, you never multiply or divide by a negative, and you're going to end up on the right with n is less than 1. So here's your answer, n is greater than 7 or n is less than 1. And there's that opening that I was talking about in the graph. N is greater than 7, so you make a circle at 7. It's not underlined, so you don't shade it in, and you go to the right. N is less than 1, make a circle at 1, don't shade it in, and everything's to the left, and there, one last time, is that opening in the middle. The other kind of compound inequality is where everything is in between two arrows. These are called and inequalities. 4m plus 4 is greater than -28, and it's less than -16. Again, let's move this down here where we have more space. And once again, to solve it, I'm going to unpeel in the opposite order of PEMDAS. First thing I'll do is move the 4. Well, I'll just show you all the things. I'm going to move the 4's over, then I'm going to divide by 4. I never divided by a negative. I never multiplied by a negative. My arrows in the end are the same arrows I had at the beginning, and I end up with just m in the middle, -8 on the left, -5 on the right. When you have and inequalities, when you have the variable and all of its stuff in between two arrows, your graph will also be in between two circles. So look for that. These and inequalities where the stuff's in the middle have graphs where the stuff's in the middle. And notice that this circle's at -5, this circle's at -8, and this one, since it's not underlined, is an open circle. Last thing, you've got to be able to sketch graphs of linear inequalities. Well, to graph the line 4/3 x plus 1, I plot the intercept and apply the slope. There's my intercept at 1. My slope is 4/3, so it goes up 4 and over 3, and I draw a line through it. That's step 1 in graphing this. If you stop here, you're not going to get very much credit. The next thing is to notice that it's an inequality that isn't underlined. When it's not underlined, it's a dotted line. So the second step is to decide, should it be dotted or should it be solid? In this case, dotted. Third and last step is to figure out which side to shade. If you don't shade, you don't get much credit. The way to do this is to pick a point that's on one side of these tracks. I usually pick 0, 0. It's an easy point to work with. So let's plug 0, 0 in for x and y and see if this is true. Is 0 greater than 4/3 times 0 plus 1? Well, 4/3 times 0 is nothing. Nothing plus 1 is 1. 0 is not more than 1. It's false. That means 0, 0 is on the wrong side of the tracks. I shade the other side. And that's what they came up with in the computer program. That's it. That's the video lesson on inequalities. As you know, on my website, in addition to this, are more questions as well as the answers to those questions.